The judge was looking at me like I was already lying before I even opened my mouth. I remember thinking that. I remember the exact feeling. Not panic, not rage, just this cold, settling certainty that no one in that room was going to believe me. My hands were flat on the table in front of me. I could feel the wood. I focused on that because if I didn't, I was going to pass out. My husband, Garrett, was sitting across the aisle with his lawyer, and he wasn't even looking at me. He was writing something on a notepad, calmly. Like this was a meeting about quarterly projections, not 22 years of our life being decided by a stranger in a black robe. His mother, Pauline, was in the gallery. Third row, I knew without looking. I could feel her there the same way you feel a draft through a wall you thought was solid. I'm 51 years old. I spent 19 years as a registered nurse in the Canadian Forces, mostly at CFB Petawawa, and one deployment to Kandahar that I don't talk about at dinner parties. I've held people's hands while they died. I've made decisions in 30 seconds that determined whether someone went home to their family or didn't. I am not, as Garrett's lawyer put it that morning, a woman prone to exaggeration and self-dramatization. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The first sign something was wrong with my health came about 3 years before any of this. I was making coffee in our kitchen in Barrie, the old house on Penetanguishene Road, the one with the leaky mudroom and the silver maple in the backyard that Garrett always said he'd trim and never did, and my left hand just stopped cooperating. Not a cramp, not pins and needles. It simply forgot what it was doing midway through lifting the pot. I told myself it was fatigue. I was still working part-time at the hospital, and we'd had a rough winter. I told myself a lot of things that year. By spring I was dropping things, cups, mostly. A patient chart once, which embarrassed me more than anything. By summer I was having episodes where my legs would go weak without warning. Not collapse, just soften, like the bones had briefly gone on vacation. My GP referred me to a neurologist in Barrie, who ran some tests and told me, with the kind of careful vagueness that I recognized immediately from my own professional life, that my results were within normal parameters but worth monitoring. Worth monitoring, I wrote that down. Garrett came to exactly one appointment. He sat in the corner of the examination room with his phone in his hand, and afterwards in the parking lot of the RVH, he said, "So they basically said you're fine." It wasn't a question. I looked at him and I thought, when did you stop being curious about me? I couldn't have told you exactly when things between us had shifted. That's the thing no one tells you about a marriage going bad. It doesn't announce itself. One day you look up and realize you've been living with a stranger for longer than you can pinpoint. And the worst part is you don't know if it happened to you or if you let it happen. Pauline had always been in our marriage the way mold is in an old house. Invisible most of the time but present in the walls. She called every Sunday without fail, and Garrett took those calls in the garage. She had opinions about how we spent our vacation time. About whether we should have renovated the kitchen when we did. About the fact that we hadn't moved to Collingwood where she and Garrett's father had retired. When I told Garrett once, gently I thought, that it might be nice if she called ahead before dropping by, he looked at me like I'd suggested something mildly criminal. "She's my mother," he said. "I know," I said. "She's also someone who walked into our bedroom last month while I was getting dressed." He didn't have an answer for that. He went back to watching the game. I should have paid more attention to that moment. I keep going back to it now. The financial picture started coming into focus about 18 months before the separation. I want to be precise about this because it matters. I am not a person who ignores numbers. I managed our household accounts for most of our marriage. Garrett was a project manager for a construction firm in Barrie and traveled frequently, so it fell to me to handle the mortgage payments, the RRSPs, the monthly bills. I knew our finances the way I knew a patient chart, not perfectly, but well enough to notice when something changed. What I noticed first was small. A transfer I didn't recognize from our joint savings, $400 to an account I didn't know the number for. I asked Garrett about it and he said it was for a work expense he'd fronted, that HR was slow to reimburse. I accepted that because it was plausible, and because I was at that point not yet looking for a reason not to. Then there was another one, then 2 more. Then a withdrawal of $11,000 from our RRSP that I found by accident when I was doing our taxes, and noticed the T4 RSP slip in a pile of mail that had been, I realized, placed face down. When I asked about that one, Garrett got a look on his face I hadn't seen before. Not guilty exactly. More like, assessed, like he was calculating something. "It was for the roof," he said. I told you about the roof. The roof cost $8,000, I said, and I paid the roofer directly. I have the receipt. A long pause. There were extra costs, he said. Supplies. I handled it. I didn't push it further that night. But I called our bank the next morning, and what they told me made me sit down on the kitchen floor and stay there for a while. The joint account I thought we'd held together for 18 years had been restructured 4 years earlier. A secondary authorized user had been added, and then, 2 years after that, the account had been quietly moved into a different category that limited my access to statements. I had been receiving paper statements. Garrett had always handled the mail, but the statements I'd seen didn't reflect the full account history. I need to be very clear. I am a 51-year-old woman with a nursing degree and 19 years of military service, and I sat on my kitchen floor for 20 minutes because I could not immediately process what I was looking at. Then I called a lawyer. Her name was Aisha, and she was exactly who I needed in that moment. Practical, calm, and very good at explaining things to people who are trying not to cry while also taking notes. Her office was downtown Barrie on the second floor above a dry cleaner's, and it smelled like coffee and paper, and I found that oddly steadying. "Tell me everything," she said. "Don't edit." So I did. Garrett moved out in November. He went to Pauline's place in Collingwood, which I thought was fitting. What followed was 6 months of legal correspondence, financial disclosure requests, and a slow-building picture that was, to put it plainly, worse than I'd expected. The RRSP withdrawal wasn't the only one. There were 3 others I hadn't found. There was also a GIC, a guaranteed investment certificate that I'd contributed to from my own income over the course of 10 years, that Garrett had partially liquidated using a power of attorney document that his lawyer produced during disclosure. The problem with the power of attorney was that I had never signed one. Aisha went quiet when she read it. Then she read it again. Then she looked at me over her reading glasses and said, "Do you want the diplomatic version or the direct one?" "Direct," I said. "Someone forged your signature," she said, and then had it notarized. I've been in a lot of hard moments in my life. I was in Kandahar when a vehicle came in with 4 soldiers and only 3 of them were going to make it. I know what it feels like when the floor drops out. This felt like that, except slower. Except I was sitting in a law office in Barrie with a cold cup of Tim Hortons on the desk and no one needed my hands right now. "Okay," I said. "Okay?" Aisha said. I said, "What do we do next?" She smiled. It was a small smile, but it was real. "We document everything," she said. "And we get you a forensic document examiner." The health situation had not improved. That fall I had my most serious episode yet. I was walking across the hospital parking lot after a shift and my left leg gave out completely. Not a stumble, a full collapse. I went down on the pavement and lay there for a moment looking up at the November sky, and a colleague, a woman I'd worked with for 4 years, Beverly, ran over and helped me up and kept saying my name in that particular tone nurses use when they're keeping calm for a patient. She drove me inside. I had a CT scan within the hour. What they found was a lesion on my upper spinal cord that had almost certainly been there for some time. The neurologist, not my original one, a different one, younger, with a manner I trusted immediately, sat across from me and explained that this was consistent with a demyelinating condition that had likely been developing for several years, and that my previous within normal parameters blood work had simply not been looking for the right things. I thought about Garrett in that parking lot outside RVH. So they basically said, "You're fine. You're going to want to start treatment," the neurologist said, "and you're going to want to stop pushing yourself the way I suspect you've been pushing yourself." "I'm in the middle of a divorce," I said. He nodded slowly. "Then push just enough to get through that," he said. "And then stop." I told my lawyer about the diagnosis. She told me to request my complete Canadian Forces medical records, which I was entitled to under the Privacy Act, and to do it immediately. "If your health has been deteriorating for several years," she said, "and your military physicals are on record, that's documentation your husband's legal team cannot touch." She was right. The Canadian Armed Forces health record system is meticulous in a way that civilian medicine sometimes isn't. Annual assessments, mandatory physicals at specific career milestones, complete and tamper-proof. My records showed, in clear clinical language, that symptoms consistent with my diagnosis had been noted as far back as 7 years ago during a routine pre-release physical at CFB Borden. 7 years ago, I had been telling doctors and, occasionally, Garrett, that something was wrong for 7 years. His legal team had already submitted a statement claiming that my health concerns were largely self-reported and clinically unsubstantiated, and that they bore directly on my capacity to manage my own financial and legal affairs. I read that statement on a Thursday evening sitting at my kitchen table. The silver maple outside was bare by then. The mudroom still leaked. I'd had to call the plumber myself 2 weeks earlier because Garrett had been the one who'd had that guy's number. I read the statement again, and then, very deliberately, I made myself a cup of tea. The hearing was in February. I don't know what I expected. I'd been to the courthouse before. Decades-old building on Worsley Street, the kind of place where the floors creak and the heating is either too much or not enough. I'd been there once years earlier for a friend's custody matter, sitting in the hall waiting, drinking vending machine coffee, and trying to look reassuring. This time I was the one walking through the front door with my lawyer, carrying a binder with 47 tabbed documents, wearing the good navy blazer I'd bought for job interviews back when I was transitioning out of the forces. Garrett was already there. He was wearing a suit I'd never seen, gray, well-fitted. Pauline was with him, in the gallery, dressed like she was going to church. She met my eyes when I walked in and lifted her chin slightly, and I thought, almost with surprise, she hates me. Not disapproves of me, not resents me, hates me. I don't know why that hadn't fully registered before. The first part of the hearing went as these things do. Aisha laid out our position on the financial irregularities. Garrett's lawyer, a man named something I can never remember clearly because I spent most of his speaking time looking at my notes, raised objections I expected. The power of attorney document was entered into evidence. The forensic examiner's report, which concluded with high confidence that my signature had been replicated by a different hand, was entered into evidence. Garrett's lawyer argued it was a clerical error, a misunderstanding. These things happened. The judge, a woman in her 60s who had listened to all of this without expression, looked up from her notes at that point. A clerical error that happened to result in $11,000 being liquidated from your client's wife's investment account, she said in the tone of someone who has heard a great many explanations. Garrett's lawyer pivoted quickly. He said that that I had a documented pattern of confusion and misremembering, particularly around financial matters, consistent with my medical condition. He said that I had filed numerous complaints against my husband over the past year, many of which were exaggerated or factually inconsistent. He said that given my health situation, certain cognitive challenges were, and here he paused, choosing his word, understandable. I was looking at the binder in front of me. Tab 31 was my Canadian Forces medical records. Then Garrett spoke. He wasn't supposed to, really, not at that moment, but his lawyer had set it up, asked him a direct question, and he answered. He turned and looked directly at me for the first time that day, and he said, clearly enough for the whole room to hear, she imagines things. She always has. You can't trust what she says. I'm sorry, but that's the truth. 22 years. He said it in 14 words. I felt something go quiet inside me, not cold, not hot. Very still. And then my legs went out. Not dramatically, I didn't fall to the floor. I felt the sensation I'd learned to recognize over the past 3 years. The one that starts in the lower back, moves down, and I gripped the edge of the table, and I suppose I made some kind of sound, because Aisha turned immediately and put her hand on my arm and said, very quietly, Carol, look at me. I looked at her. Do you need a moment? She said. No, I said. My own voice sounded strange to me. Far away, keep going. But across the gallery something was already happening. There was movement in the second row. A woman stood up. She was in her late 40s, dark-haired, wearing a blue winter coat that she hadn't fully removed when she sat down. She'd kept it on one shoulder. I understood now, because she'd been planning to move quickly if she needed to. She was already moving up the aisle toward the front of the courtroom. She said, Your Honor, I'm a physician. I need a moment with this woman. The judge held up a hand. The room stopped. The woman crouched beside my chair. I knew her. She was Dr. Amara, a name I'd known for 30 years, since we'd done our nursing training at the same hospital in Ottawa, and she'd later gone to medical school while I'd gone into the forces. We'd stayed loosely in touch. Cards at Christmas. Occasional emails. I hadn't seen her in person in almost 4 years, but she'd come when Aisha called her, without hesitation. She took my wrist. She looked at my pupils. She asked me 2 questions quietly. Then she stood up and addressed the judge. Your Honor, she said, I've known this woman for 30 years. I was her clinical colleague during our training, and I'm familiar with her medical history both before and after her military service. I would like to state as a physician that what you're seeing right now is a documented neurological symptom, not distress, not performance, not exaggeration. And I would like to submit, if the court allows, that the characterization of this woman as cognitively unreliable is not consistent with any clinical evidence I'm aware of. The judge looked at her for a long moment. Are you here as a witness? I was listed as a potential witness for the applicant, Amara said. I haven't been called yet. The judge looked at Aisha. We'd like to call her now, Aisha said. What happened next took about 45 minutes, but I will tell it the way it felt, which was much faster, like watching a building come down from the inside. Amara sat in the witness box. She had, I learned later, driven down from Ottawa that morning at 5 a.m. because she'd gotten Aisha's message the night before and decided she wasn't going to miss this. She walked the court through my medical history in clear, precise language that managed to be both clinical and completely human. She talked about the spinal cord lesion. She talked about the timeline, 7 years of documented symptoms that exactly contradicted the claim that my health concerns were fabricated or exaggerated. She referenced my Canadian Forces records by number and date, and she said something that I think of still. The Canadian Armed Forces Health Documentation System does not accommodate retroactive change. What was recorded when it happened. 7 years ago, medical personnel noted symptoms consistent with what this woman has been reporting consistently ever since. This is not a woman who imagines things. This is a woman who was not listened to. There was a silence in that courtroom. I've been in a lot of silences. There are different kinds. There's the silence after bad news, which is numb and soft. There's the silence of a room where something terrible just happened, which has a kind of electric stillness to it. This one was different. This was the silence of a room recalibrating. Garrett's lawyer tried to cross-examine. He asked about the scope of Amara's current treating relationship with me. There was none. She was a witness, not my physician. He asked if she was aware that I had a history of filing complaints. She said she was aware I had advocated for myself in a medical context. Yes. He asked if it was possible that my neurological symptoms could affect my perception and memory. Amara paused, just briefly, and then she said, yes. It's also possible that a decade of financial fraud committed by a trusted spouse could affect a person's ability to clearly reconstruct a financial timeline. I think the court might want to consider which of those possibilities is better supported by the evidence. Garrett's lawyer said something. Aisha said something. The judge said something that I think was sustained, but I can't be entirely certain because I was looking at the table in front of me and trying to breathe normally. The forensic document examiner had already delivered her report. The judge had already seen it. But it was Amara's testimony, I think, that changed the shape of the room. Before it, the proceedings had felt like a negotiation. After it, they felt like an accounting. The judge recessed for 20 minutes. When she came back, she read her initial findings in a voice that was very even and very clear. The power of attorney document had been determined to bear a forged signature. The liquidation of the GIC was therefore unauthorized. The financial transfers from the joint account to the unknown account, which Aisha's forensic accountant had, by then traced to an account in Garrett's sole name, were subject to full recovery. The court was referring the matter of the forged document to the Ontario Provincial Police for potential criminal investigation. She said this part twice. Garrett's lawyer had gone the color of old cement. Garrett himself was still. He didn't look at me. He looked at the wall to my left, and his expression was the one I recognized from 22 years of watching him when something hadn't worked out the way he'd planned. Projects, mostly, or hockey scores, or arguments with his brother, a kind of shuttered, inward look, as if he was already revising his understanding of events to accommodate a different outcome. Pauline in the gallery said something that I didn't catch. The court officer looked in her direction and she went quiet. I sat there and I let it happen. Aisha touched my arm afterward, outside in the corridor. That's not everything, she said. There's still the asset division, still the recovery process, but the finding on the forgery, that's real, that's on record. No, I said. The OPP referral is serious, she said. He may face charges. I nodded. I'd known, somewhere, that this was the likely outcome once the forensic report came back. It was one thing to know it intellectually. It was another to be standing in the hall of the Barry courthouse on a February afternoon with salt-stained boots and a binder full of documents, and here it said plainly, "Are you okay?" Aisha asked. I thought about it honestly. "I don't know yet," I said. She nodded, like that was a completely acceptable answer. I appreciated that. I called Beverly that evening, my colleague, the one who'd helped me up in the parking lot. She picked up on the second ring, and I could hear the television in the background, and I said, "It went okay." And she said, "Oh, thank God," and we talked for 40 minutes about nothing in particular, which was exactly what I needed. I called my daughter Nora, who had driven up from Toronto the night before, and was at my house waiting. I could hear the kettle when she picked up. She said, "Tell me everything." I told her everything. She cried a little. I didn't, not then. I think I was still running on something that wasn't quite adrenaline and wasn't quite shock, just some operational mode I'd developed years ago that gets the job done first and processes later. Nora had been the one who'd quietly worried about me the longest, through all of it. The health stuff, the financial discovery, the separation. She'd never once said "I told you so" about Garrett, even though I think she'd had reservations about him years before I was willing to see them. She's 28 and she's a better person than either of her parents, which I consider my actual greatest achievement. Amara had driven back to Ottawa by the time I tried to reach her. I left a voicemail. I said, "I don't know how to thank you for what you did today. I'll figure out something better to say when my brain is working properly again." She texted back 2 hours later, "You would have done it for me. You already did once. Don't forget." I sat with that for a while. The thing about being in the forces for 19 years is that you learn a particular kind of friendship. One that doesn't require constant maintenance, that can lie quiet for years and still be solid underneath. Amara and I hadn't spoken in person in 4 years, but when the moment came, she got in her car at 4:30 in the morning and drove 2 hours on a February highway so she could sit in a witness box and tell the truth about someone she cared about. I don't think she knows how much that undid me. I mean that in the best possible way. The OPP investigation took 8 months. Garrett was charged under the Criminal Code of Canada with fraud over $5,000 and forgery of a document, 2 counts. The proceedings are not finished as I write this, but they have begun. And that beginning matters in ways I couldn't have fully articulated before I understood what it felt like to be told, in open court, by someone who was supposed to love me, that I was not to be believed. The GIC funds were recovered. The money transferred to Garrett's private account is still being untangled. There is a process for this, and it is slow, but it is moving. Aisha sends me updates every few weeks. I've gotten better at reading them without my pulse going up. Pauline has not reached out. I didn't expect her to. But her husband, Garrett's father, Gerald, a quiet man who I'd always liked and who I think was as surprised by all of this as I was, sent me a card in April. He wrote, in the handwriting of a man his age, careful and slightly labored, "I hope you're doing well, Carol. I never thought it would come to this. I'm sorry for what he did, that's all. Just that. I put it on the refrigerator and I look at it sometimes. I've started treatment. The neurologist, the younger one, who I've decided I trust completely, has me on a disease-modifying therapy that we spent 3 appointments discussing and landed on together, which I appreciated. I have good weeks and harder weeks. The episodes of weakness have not stopped, but they've become more predictable, which is its own kind of manageable. I went back to the hospital part-time in March, though I moved from the floor to a clinical educator role, which my legs are more suited to right now, and which turns out to be work I find genuinely satisfying. Nora visited 3 weekends in a row after the hearing. She brought food every time. She's a better cook than I ever was. And we ate dinner at the kitchen table and talked, or didn't talk, in the comfortable way of people who've been through something hard together and come out trusting each other more on the other side. The silver maple is still in the backyard. In May it came out fully, all at once the way silver maples do. Big flat leaves that turn the whole yard silver green on a bright afternoon. I stood at the kitchen window and looked at it, and I thought about all the years I'd looked at that tree without really seeing it, because there was always something else to manage, something else to worry about, something else that wasn't quite right. That I was trying not to notice. I noticed it that day. It was beautiful. I made a note to actually trim it this fall myself, or to find someone who would, to just handle it, the way I've learned to handle things I used to wait for someone else to do. Garrett hadn't trimmed it in 22 years anyway, might as well start now.